So Ying, Paul, thank you so much for being here today. I want to maybe just kind of start with a baseline. We've both been, or all three of us have been associated with, in some form or fashion, enterprise computing and enterprise software delivery. So in your minds, what has been sort of the biggest breakthrough in the last maybe 5 to 7 years? Maybe Ying, we'll start with you in terms of at Discover. What has been sort of the one thing that you can point to that says, this is what helped us change the conversation as it relates to software delivery here at Discover?
So I think, like I said earlier in my presentation, I think the whole evolution of architecture is something to me was really opened up my mind. Think about like 10 years, 20 years ago, the architecture we had mostly a tiered architecture. Right. That was like state of art, right? So we have the UX, we have the middle tier, we have the back end. It was like such a great concept and easy to grasp and easy to learn and easy to build. But once you build, it's like a house you can change so easily. And that's what really the painful experience we're going through right now because of the architecture. The evolutionary architecture, even though it sounds fuzzy, right, it doesn't make sense. But when you actually practice it makes things so much easier because you start slow, you start small, and then you build onto it and you learn as you go. It just makes so much more sense. To me, I think that's really a breakthrough for us, and then how we apply that to our new way of building the system. And then I think it's going to help us to grow and to make changes much easier in the future.
Yeah. Okay. Paul, how about you? I know you've been working focused in services for a very long time. What are some of the things that you see that enterprises are really kind of latching onto that's helping them change the question?
Yes, so it dovetails pretty nicely with what she was talking about, which is composable architecture, right? Whether you want to call that microservices or SOA, for those of us that lived through that.
Right.
They're all underpinned with one very simple thing, which is API-driven computing, right? The ability to have a common standardized way to address your infrastructure, your middleware, your application tier, to actually have applications talk a standard way from one application to another. And that all comes back to having standardized and more durable APIs, right? Things that are versioned, things that are actually meaningful, rather than what we had 15, 20 years ago, which was technically still an API, but was very lumpy, not very well versioned, led to those tightly coupled architectures that were harder to modernize.
So that makes sense, and I think to your point, back to the sort of SOA comments, some of these concepts aren't necessarily brand new.
Nope.
So the question is, how long, back to your talk, Ying, how was it that we were able to put up with so many years, if not decades, of deployments in the middle of the night on Fridays and Saturdays, executives holding their breaths on Sundays until these systems have come up? What is it in terms of that evolution that's been maybe something that stands out? And I think a lot of that is platform, but can you kind of talk to how the conversation around we can do better and we can do better for our own people, how that sort of originated at Discover?
Yeah, I think it's really a mindset change, and it's a culture shift for sure. I would say that even today, we've been already doing this for a while, and also even proving to the organization, you could do it. This is the new way of working. But still, there's definitely hesitation, and then the worry. It almost feels like midnight is the safest time, right, for us to do. I think we're still almost like going through that, like keep telling the organization this is a new way we could do it, this is how we will make it work, and actually it's safer because you actually have people watching it during the day, not like midnight, like sleepy and trying to do something and very error prone. I think it's a definite evolution, it's a culture shift, and then it's get away from the fear and then really just to prove that you totally could do it.
Right.
And then it's the better way to do it.
Yeah. We look at sort of IT operations, some of these folks who've been typically responsible for keeping systems as well as platforms up and running and becoming accustomed to these middle of the night deployments. But we also see sort of a fractured relationship historically with development teams on the other side of the organization, in many ways being incentivized to push value to customers and to create change inside of environments. Paul, can you kind of talk about how these two sort of sub-organizations and two different personas are really coming together, and how a platform like Kubernetes really makes that possible.
Yeah, I actually think this is an interesting talk track, right? We've all seen the walls that get built between organizational silos, right? The database administrators don't talk to the security people don't talk to the ops people, so on and so forth. I won't say that Kubernetes solves it, but it makes it a little bit easier, right? So kind of going back to the API-driven discussion, right? One of the challenges that you've seen if you've been in this industry for a while is the penchant that we all had to follow kind of ITIL standards, right? Or something derived from ITIL, where we told, rather than a coworker having a discussion saying, hey, let's work on this technology together and make it work, open a ticket for that, right? And that ticket might introduce, an hour of latency, a week of latency, a month of latency, depending on the process that a company might follow supporting that ticket. But that kind of dehumanizes the whole process. And it also doesn't take advantage of the technology that's at our disposal. So to me, I think that's where Kubernetes starts to provide some concept of that, is to move away from ticket-driven infrastructure to API-driven infrastructure, because that exact same request and the data that you're trying to collect, right, about the business, about who's making the change request, why is it being put through, why is it happening at midnight in some cases, right? That's stuff that you can actually capture in an API, right? So you can still log it in a meaningful way, so you can actually go back and introspect and inspect what went on, but at the same time now you can make it instantaneous, right? I think that helps because it makes everyone's job a little bit easier. But again, it's not a universal thing. I think what they're talking about on the other side in terms of culture, right, it is definitely one of the things that comes into play there, right? Like you have to have people that are comfortable making the changes at 2 p.m. in the afternoon.
Right.
And you also have to have the technology that supports it. So I think those two things go hand in hand.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I wanted to go next. So to your talk, Ying, and talking about the fact that pushing to production during the day, obviously a very new concept, probably somewhat, borderline enthusiastic sort of spirit and nature behind that. But can you talk about maybe some of the folks on the business side who have maybe have been reserved about initial pushes to production? We talked about sort of the IT side, but can you kind of give us what the reaction on the business side has been as well?
I think the business really loves the fact that things are getting done the minute they want it, but they're also worried about obviously the customer impact, right? So I think historically changes always sort of associated with failure, or changes are the ones that's going to introduce problems for us. And then that actually was true for longest time for us. But I think one of the first thing we took it is to actually build a lot of capability within the actual pipeline itself, where we can safely fail over. We can safely stop the push if we see there are problems.
Right.
And then we have a lot of features that build into like canary release, where we just do 5% of traffic and see how that goes. And then we pull back if immediately something happens. So it does take a lot of proof for people to finally feel a little better. Actually, this morning before I came to this, I was pulled into a meeting with our enterprise risk folks. And then there's still hesitation of, you are constantly putting stuff into production, you're pulling back. Well, that's a good thing, because we'll pull back because we saw a problem. Now we can go fix it before we push back into the production. I think there's definitely a lot of conversation that still need to happen. And then I think it is upon us and technology to sort of prove to them and then show them, this is something that can happen and it will happen, and then this is where we're going.
Yeah. So Paul, I know you're sort of the tip of the spear as it relates to servicing in this area, especially in the enterprise space. How far down the path, if you sort of zoom out, do you feel like we are? Do you feel like 10% of organizations are like Discover, who get it, who are long down the path on their journey, or is it greater than that? Like, what's the spectrum there?
Yeah, I think it varies, right? So it's never an organizational wide shift, at least not that happens right away, right? It's individual departments or individual business units in some cases, right, that make the change, make the shift. But then even within that construct over time, they'll regress, right? Like it's never a linear progression where it's just like, hey, we got it this time, we're good to go.
Right.
Something will happen where you'll be forced to deploy at midnight again, right? Somebody will leave, some organizational changes will happen, companies will merge, companies will splinter, so it's a constant journey. I'd say we're definitely farther off from starting, right, than we were 10 years ago,
Right.
where this was, hey, we'll talk about Agile, we'll talk about XP, but we didn't actually understand all of the parts that go into that, right? Like, one of the things that I like to talk about is, technology 15, 20 years ago was about risk mitigation, right, more than it was about innovation.
Right.
I think we're starting to understand that every business has to be a technology business to a degree. That sounds cliche,
Yep.
but it's also true. When
Absolutely.
you have a food distribution company up here talking about innovation, that's literally brick and mortar,
Absolutely.
150-year-old company that's trying to innovate.
Absolutely.
And so I think we're better off than we were, but we've still got a long way to go, right? And I think it is definitely pockets, right? So every company I talk to has pockets that are leaning in, but there's still so much work to do.
Yeah. So just some parting thoughts from each of you. Where in this very, very quickly moving space do you see the future of enterprises and sort of modernization journeys headed? Maybe specifically at Discover for you, Ying.
I think, card acquisitions are the group that I'm leading up to was the first to do this at scale. So we almost like a test case for the organization. I think the organization definitely is very excited to see what we've done and the results. And then also to Paul's point, we see ourselves as a technology company now.
Right.
So we wanted to be the ones that be able to compete with fintechs and be able to roll out features and products fast. So we have the realization that we got to do this. There's no other way. But I think we're still in the process of figuring out how do we scale this beyond just us. Our acquisitions is only a slice of our business. We got a lot more businesses, but it's upon us to figure out how do we scale this, how do we make the entire enterprise to be like us.
Are you being brought in as sort of a subject matter expert, as someone who has an organization who's done this successfully to maybe other sort of teams or organizations inside of Discover that haven't started yet?
I think he's trying to recruit you.
Yeah, would you be open to talking to other customers? Or other enterprises
We've
like that?
definitely been internally, we've definitely talking to our internal teams and our organizations. My teams do lunch and learns and snack and learns, and then our architects now probably is the most popular people. Everybody wants to meet with them and learn how we did it. I think there's definitely a lot of interest, but I also say it is very, very hard. It's not something that can easily pull off, and then literally it takes endurance.
Sure, there's no easy button, right?
Yes.
Yeah, makes sense. So Paul, what about you? I mean, where do you see sort of the future of enterprise computing, especially in, again, very exciting times and things seem to change almost quarter to quarter?
Yeah, I think, technology is a part of the business, is the bigger narrative that I would put out there. And when you start thinking about yourself, if you're in IT or if you're a VP of application development, whatever your role may be, you start thinking of yourself as a part of the bigger business. Yeah. You start to assess how you interact with that business in a different way. And so what I tell people when they ask me that question is start looking at the latency and the friction, right? The latency and the human interactions, right? Are you telling people file a ticket, I'll get back to you next month, right? Or are you actually helping them serve the business? And the friction is how much, candidly, noise do you create, right? Is it something where if someone comes to you and asks for a very simple thing, you're asking them to fill out a 10-page form, right? Are you asking them to jump through a bunch of hoops? How do you actually lower those barriers so that the business can move faster, right?
And I think that's the point you were talking about, Ying, in terms of lead time to change, right? What are all of the, sort of what's the latency between two people having a conversation about doing a non-traditional hard thing here, but actually pulling that off in order to deliver value to the customer on behalf of the business?
Well, and if you look at card acquisition, right, it's a very good thing for everyone to kind of take into account. You have an equivalent to card acquisition every day. How fast are you serving the business? And if you do what Ying and her team did, and you actually do an event storm, right, and you just kind of break it down step by step and say, for the people that are coming to me and asking for me to deploy a web server, for the people that are coming to me and asking for me to help them develop, a new marketing splash page or something like that, how many steps are involved? What can we automate out of those steps? What can we make faster for them, right? You want to basically make that as seamless a process as possible.
Yeah, makes sense. That's great stuff. Thank you, Ying. Thank you, Paul, for being part of our session today.